Hi everyone, Oscar here. For those of you who know me, I've worked as a farmer but also as a policy staffer and volunteer with a bunch of farmer organisations over the last 21 years. I probably have a reputation of being a bit of a greenie. I do believe in climate science and I actually support the federal ALP government's agricultural sectoral emissions plan and support the goal of net zero. So with that context, I want you to understand that I'm not purely anti-Labor and I'm not anti-Green, but I want to talk about something which is an issue I've worked on professionally in the past on several occasions, and which is up for consultation right now. It's the EPBC, the Federal Environment Laws. There's a major set of new consultation processes underway, and you need, as a farmer or a member of the agribusiness community, or as an agronomist or an agent, a leader of a farmer organisation, or anyone really involved with agriculture, you really need to understand this stuff. Like I said, I've had 21 years experience working and reviewing various legislative issues associated with land management, both in New South Wales and at the federal level. I've done it and been involved professionally and as a volunteer in a few of these reviews. The current statutory consultation process, let me just say this, it's the largest change to environmental regulations that this country has ever seen, ever. These changes are huge and will have a fundamental and systemic change to the way your farm business operates. Your ability to get permissions through the state governments is about to be completely overwritten by federal laws. Your costs in terms of seeking those permissions and what you can and can't do, the information about your farm that's available to regulators, legislators, compliance processes, or even made available to the general public. All of these things are about to change fundamentally, and you've got a very limited window for consultation. I need you to go and look at it. If you're not aware of it, you won't be able to have your say, and if you don't have your say, then, well, you'll be stuck with it for several years to come. Importantly, what follows is not me writing out notes and giving you all the details. It is a bit of AI junk. I use a couple of AI tools to take public source data and information, farmer association submissions, NFF work, a whole bunch of things that are publicly available, including these new proposed draft regulations that are up for consultation. And I've fed it all into an AI, basically created a junky AI podcast. Sorry, I'm harvesting. I don't have the time and resources to do things properly and give you a detailed blow by blow. What follows is a little audio briefing. It's long because this is hugely complicated. It deals with offsets, approvals, data, systems of regulations, the state and government, Commonwealth government relationships and how their new standards will work. 50 minutes, sorry for the length, sorry for the fact that it's AI garbage, but I have gone through it all. It is accurate, and it is something that you as a land manager or someone involved in agribusiness should probably check out. And if you are as concerned as I am, like I said, I'm probably seen as a bit of a greenie amongst the farming community, but this one is setting my hairs on edge. This is really big and this is really problematic. If you're as worried as I am, you should get in there and get a submission into the federal government very shortly. Good luck with it, and hope that in your readings you find some ways for the Commonwealth to improve these proposals and that you can give them suggestions that will make them less worse, because at the moment they are very significant and they will be very costly to a very large number of farmers over the next few years.
So imagine a massive property development corporation. They just bulldoze a critically endangered woodland on the edge of a major city to build this sprawling new shopping mall.
Right, a massive concrete footprint.
Exactly. Now, under the new rules we are looking at today, the penalty for that destruction is, well, it's effectively a fee.
Yeah, they just pay a predetermined charge into a central government fund, dust off their hands, and, they never have to think about that woodland again.
But then, flip the script. Imagine a family farmer who agrees to protect and offset a patch of native trees on their own property.
Which sounds like a great thing.
You would think. But their reward,
Huh.
a 100-year legally binding contract pinned to their property title that makes them financially and legally liable for managing the impacts of global climate change.
I mean, it sounds like a dystopian legal fiction, but it is the exact mechanical reality of the policy framework currently being rolled out across the country right now.
And that is exactly why we are here. If you are a land manager or someone who follows agricultural policy, or frankly, just an Australian trying to make sense of the tidal wave of new environmental legislation sweeping across the continent, well, this deep dive is for you.
Absolutely.
We are unpacking the sweeping EPBC reforms. That's the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. Today, our mission is to map out exactly how the new national environmental standards, the bilateral agreements between the Commonwealth and the states, and the cascading subordinate legislation are fundamentally rewriting the rules of how agricultural land is managed.
And we really have to ground this in the immediate present because the clock is loudly ticking. I mean, today is Monday, May 11th, 2026.
Right. It's happening right now.
Exactly. The window for anyone to actually influence this outcome is rapidly closing. The statutory consultation period on the exposure drafts for the Environmental Offset Standard and the Matters of National Environmental Significance, or MNES standard, is open right now.
But it doesn't stay open forever.
No, it ends definitively at 11:59 p.m. AEST on June 9th, 2026.
So that's less than a month away. I look at this entire legislative package, and the best way I can describe it is like a tectonic plate shift happening right underneath the paddock.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah, because on the surface, you look out the window and the farm looks the same. The rhetoric coming out of Canberra sounds like a simple bureaucratic update, modernizing systems, streamlining data.
But underneath the soil, the foundational jurisdiction, the daily operational reality, and just the sheer legal liability of anyone managing land is shifting violently. The tectonic analogy is perfectly apt. Just like geological shifts, the pressure has been building out of sight, and the impacts will be structural and permanent.
Right.
To really grasp the magnitude of this, we need to untangle the timeline and the machinery of how this reform is actually being implemented. Because the sheer confusion surrounding the staggered rollout is by itself creating massive instability in the agricultural sector.
Yes, let's definitely pull the timeline apart. Because, I mean, if I am trying to run a business and farming is a business requiring long-term capital investment, I need to know the rules of the game.
Yep.
But the government seems to be rolling the rules out in, 5 different overlapping stages?
Exactly. The overarching legislative vehicle, the Environment Protection Reform Bills, passed the Parliament back in November 2025.
That was the big, highly visible political moment.
Yeah, but passing the bill was just building the outer shell of the car. The engine, the steering, the brakes, those are being installed piecemeal. In December 2025, they laid down the foundational elements.
Okay.
Then, in February 2026, we saw the commencement of what the government called early flexible processes.
Early flexible processes, which, sounds lovely, but it doesn't actually tell a land manager what they can or cannot do with the tractor on a Tuesday.
Precisely. Which brings us to the incoming milestones that have real teeth. On July 1st, 2026, the new National Environmental Protection Agency, the National EPA, officially commences operations alongside Environment Information Australia, or EIA.
And the EIA is the Data and Satellite Integration Arm, right?
That's right. Following that, from mid-2026 through to December 2026, the finalized national environmental standards will be locked in to guide decision-making, accompanied by what they are branding as faster assessments.
And right now, sitting in this consultation window closing in June, we are staring at the exposure drafts for the MNES standard, the Environmental Offset Standard, and the Tranche 2 regulations.
Yep, and those Tranche 2 regulations are the rules that actually dictate how this national EPA will function and supposedly reduce regulatory duplication.
You hit on the crucial element there, the regulations and the standards. Because the government's stated aim throughout this entire multi-year process has been to halt environmental decline by creating consistency, transparency, enforceable standards, and integrated data. But the mechanism they have chosen to achieve this is, it's a heavy reliance on subordinate legislation.
I want to pause there because subordinate legislation is one of those dry legal terms that makes people's eyes glaze over.
Oh, absolutely.
But it is the absolute core of the danger here. When a primary bill goes through Parliament, it's debated. The media covers it. The opposition picks it apart.
All right, it's public.
Exactly. But subordinate legislation, the actual standards and regulations, they are often just drafted in a departmental backroom and signed off by a minister. That is the political economy of the drafting process.
So it bypasses the big debate.
Yep. Subordinate legislation contains the actual regulatory teeth. It defines the thresholds, the penalties, the definitions of what constitutes habitat.
So by putting the most aggressive and restrictive rules into the subordinate standards rather than the primary act, the bureaucracy avoids the messy, high-profile, prime-time parliamentary debate.
You've got it. But for the person on the ground, those standards are the law.
So put yourself in the boots of a farmer. You are sitting at the kitchen table looking at a 10-year business plan. You're planning crop rotations. You're looking at a multi-year grazing cycle. Maybe you need to upgrade some irrigation infrastructure. How do you possibly commit capital when the legal boundaries of what you are allowed to do are rolling out in these staggered, opaque phases?
Well, you don't, or you do so at immense personal risk. It induces a state of chronic, paralyzing uncertainty.
I can imagine.
You can make a capital decision today based on your current understanding of the law, only to find out 6 months from now that a newly finalized federal standard has retroactively categorized your ongoing management practice as a federal compliance breach. Yeah, the overarching bill is passed, but the actual granular rules dictating farm operations are essentially a moving target until late 2026.
And that uncertainty gets exponentially worse when we look at how these new federal rules are going to interact with the state laws that farmers are already used to.
This is a huge point.
Because this isn't just about adding a new federal rule. It is about forcefully overriding the existing state agricultural frameworks.
This is the linchpin of the entire reform. The Commonwealth is aggressively pushing to negotiate what are called bilateral agreements with state governments. Places like New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland.
And the headline pitch for these agreements is great, right?
Yep.
Creating a single assessment process.
Right, the famous one-stop shop, everyone hates red tape. If I want to do something on my land, I don't want to fill out a form for the state agricultural department and then fill out the exact same form for the federal environment department.
So streamlining that sounds great in theory.
In theory, yes. But the catch lies in the statutory test required for a state framework to actually get accredited under one of these bilateral agreements.
Okay, what's the test?
The Commonwealth isn't just accepting the state systems as they are. The state system must pass a legal test proving it is not inconsistent with the new national environmental standards.
Not inconsistent with. That is an incredibly loaded piece of legal phrasing. It basically means the federal government is setting a floor.
It is an absolute federal floor. And it fundamentally alters the balance of power because it operates on a strict no-regression principle.
What does that look like practically?
Think of it as a one-way ratchet that only turns upward toward more stringency. If the federal MNES standard tightens its definition of what constitutes an endangered habitat, the state standard must automatically tighten to mirror it, or the state loses its accreditation.
So there's no wiggle room.
None. The state can never, under any circumstances, drop below that federal baseline to account for local conditions or economic realities.
So let's look at what this actually destroys on a practical level. Because for decades, state governments have hammered out these deeply pragmatic, highly specific compromises with local farming communities.
Right.
Take New South Wales. You have the RAMA codes, routine agricultural management activities. If I'm a farmer in NSW, RAMA is my Bible.
It dictates the day-to-day.
Exactly. It tells me that I can clear a certain distance along a fence line for fire safety without needing a massive environmental impact statement. It allows me to clear certain invasive native scrub so my livestock can actually walk through the paddock. It's a localized, practical set of rules.
And in Victoria, you have localized planting allowances, and in other parts of NSW, you have local land services, or LLS exemptions. These frameworks exist because agriculture requires daily routine intervention in the landscape.
Exactly. But under this not inconsistent with test, what happens to my local RAMA codes?
They're at acute risk of being completely voided.
Gone.
It's just gone. If a pragmatic state law, like a RAMA code, allows a farmer to conduct routine clearing or regrowth management, but the new, rigid federal MNES standard restricts that activity, the federal standard acts as a supremacy clause.
So the federal law wins.
Always. For any activity that even tangentially touches a defined matter of national environmental significance, the state exemption is functionally dead.
That is massive. We are talking about wiping out decades of localized, hard-won agricultural policy.
It really is a clean sweep of the old system.
And think about what this does to the local state officers, the people actually working for the LLS and NSW or the Department of Environment, Land, Water, and Planning, DELWP of Victoria.
The people who actually know the area.
Right. These officers live in the communities, they know the farmers, they know the history of a specific property. Under the old system, a farmer could call up their local officer and say, hey, I need to clean up this regrowth in the back paddock, the history of that block. And the officer had the professional discretion to look at it, apply the state rules pragmatically, and say, yes, that's routine farming, go ahead.
Well, that era of professional local discretion is over. Once these bilateral agreements are locked in, those local state officers effectively become federal delegates.
So they aren't working for the state anymore, functionally.
Functionally, no. They are no longer operating as partners in regional agriculture. They are the frontline compliance agents for the national EPA. Their entire internal calculus shifts.
So.
When a farmer asks for advice or approval, the officer is no longer asking, is this practical, sustainable land management? They are forced to ask, if I approve this, can my decision survive an aggressive post-approval audit by the federal EPA?
Oh, wow. Think about the psychology of that. If I'm a state officer and I know the national EPA in Canberra is looking over my shoulder with the power to penalize me or my department, I'm going to become terrified of making a pragmatic call.
The term used to describe this phenomenon is defensive bureaucracy. To protect themselves from federal scrutiny, public compliance registers, or the threat of activist litigation, local officers will simply stop taking risks.
It's just self-preservation.
Exactly. Even if their own eyes and local knowledge tell them a farmer is just doing basic paddock maintenance, the safest bureaucratic move is to say no or to demand an exhaustive ecological survey. They manage their own career risk by maximizing the farmer's compliance burden.
There is a brilliant analogy in the source material that illustrates the absurdity of this federal overreach perfectly. It's called the Sovereign Garden and the Commonwealth Mower.
Oh, I love this one.
It's so clear. Imagine a homeowner who lives in a typical suburb. She has mowed her front lawn every single Sunday for 40 years. It's her routine, it's her land, it's a completely normal established use of the property.
Right.
But 1 month, she goes away on a long holiday. She waits, say, 15 days between mows. Suddenly, a new federal threshold kicks in. A satellite in orbit run by Environment Information Australia flags her slightly overgrown lawn as previously uncleared vegetation.
It captures the mechanism beautifully.
Right, so she comes home, fires up the victim mower, and her local council officer, who has waved to her every Sunday for 4 decades, runs over and tells her to stop.
Because he has to.
Exactly. Under the old rules, the local officer would just laugh and say, grass got a bit long, eh? But under this new bilateral agreement, the council officer is legally bound by the federal standard. The officer has to forcefully push this homeowner into a massive federal pipeline of avoid, mitigate, repair, and compensate.
Yep.
The homeowner has to hire a botanist to survey her lawn before she can cut the grass.
And as ridiculous as the sovereign garden analogy sounds in a suburban context, it is the exact literal reality of what is about to happen to farmers managing hundreds or thousands of hectares.
It's mind-boggling.
Applying rigid, national, satellite-driven environmental baselines to historically and actively managed landscapes fundamentally breaks the system of agriculture.
Which takes us straight from the theory of defensive bureaucracy into the brutal reality on the ground. Let's talk about the specific traps, the enforcement mechanisms, and the fines.
We have to.
Because the transition from local pragmatism to federal compliance is not just annoying, it's financially ruinous. We need to dissect the 15-year rule, which seems to be the most dangerous trap in the entire legislative package.
It really is. Under the EPBC Act, there has historically been an exemption for continuous use. This was the critical legal shield for agriculture.
How did that work?
Section 43B essentially stated that if you were undertaking a lawful continuous use of the land before the environmental laws came into effect, you could continue that routine management without triggering federal assessment. It acknowledged that farming is an ongoing cycle.
But the new reforms take a sledgehammer to Section 43B.
They do. The exposure drafts explicitly narrow the continuous use exemption by introducing a hard, arbitrary cutoff.
Which is?
The new rule states that if a piece of land has not been cleared or actively managed in the last 15 years, it is categorically no longer considered an existing use.
I have to stop and push back on the fundamental logic of that, because it is staggering. Nature does not carry a calendar.
No.
Agriculture in Australia is dictated by rainfall, by drought cycles, by commodity prices, and by the biological growth rates of different plant species. What if you have a grazier operating in semi-arid country, and they have managed a sustainable multi-generational regrowth cycle for a species like mulga?
Right.
Let's say their standard ecologically sustainable rotation is 18 to 20 years between managing that vegetation. Their grandfather did it, their father did it, they do it. It works. The ecosystem is intact.
Well, under the strict text of the new standards, the ecological sustainability of that 18-year cycle is entirely irrelevant. Completely. The department's own documentation explicitly states that the 15-year timeframe does not allow for variations in growth rates across different regions, nor does it consider the landholder's intent to clear or manage at a later date.
So it's just a blank rule.
It is a hard-edged administrative line drawn on a map by policymakers in Canberra.
So on year 14, the grazier is a lawful, sustainable farmer. On year 16, their continuous use shield evaporates, and the legislation treats them exactly the same as a property developer who just bought a virgin block of bushland to pave over for a car park.
Legally, they are thrown into the exact same regulatory pool. If that grazier tries to manage that 16-year-old regrowth, they trigger a federal assessment.
Wow.
And once that tripwire is crossed, the burden of proof shifts entirely onto the landholder. You cannot simply explain to a local officer that this is part of your historical grazing rotation.
Because they can't help you anymore.
Exactly. You are required to provide formal, scientifically defensible evidence that your activity will not significantly impact a matter of national environmental significance.
And scientifically defensible evidence is a polite way of saying you have to open your wallet and hire an expensive consultant.
Exactly. Based on the analysis of these new requirements, the ecological surveys and threatened species assessments required to satisfy the national EPA routinely cost between $20,000 and $70,000 per assessment.
$70,000.
Yes. And the landholder bears that cost entirely out of pocket just for the privilege of proving they aren't committing a federal offense on their own historical working farm.
Let's ground this in a really mundane, everyday farming activity. One of the case studies from the sources talks about paddock squaring or weed spraying.
Right. Very common.
Suppose I have a paddock, and over the years the edges have gotten a bit rough. Maybe some invasive African boxthorn has crept in, or some scrub has grown out. I bought a new GPS-guided tractor, and for the auto steer to work efficiently and safely, I need to square up the edges of that paddock.
Makes perfect sense.
Under the old, locally managed system, what did that process look like?
Under the old system, that was a highly localized, practical conversation. It might have been a $10,000 operational job. You would talk to your local LLS officer, explain that you needed to square the paddock for machinery efficiency or to control the boxthorn.
Okay, simple enough.
The officer would come out, look at the site, use their discretion, and perhaps say, all right, go ahead and square it up, but leave that large, hollow-bearing tree in the corner for the birds. It was informal, it was fast, and it achieved a balance between agricultural efficiency and basic conservation.
Fast forward to the new framework. The local officer is now a federal delegate terrified of a national EPA audit. The EIA satellites are watching. What happens to my paddock squaring job?
It transforms into a bureaucratic nightmare. The officer looks at the national standard. They check the federal satellite database, which might show that the edge of your paddock falls under a broad, low-resolution potential habitat overlay.
Right, because the satellite map is vague.
Exactly. Paralyzed by the fear of approving something that breaches the strict MNES standard, the officer tells you, I cannot authorize this. You need to commission a full florist survey, a targeted threatened species assessment, and a GIS mapping report.
So I have to find a consultant.
Yes. And the ecological consultants are booked out 6 months in advance. Then the weather delays the survey because certain species only flower in spring.
Oh, man.
By the time you get the report back, submit it for the newly fast-tracked federal assessment and wait for an outcome. 6 to 12 months have passed. What used to be a $10,000 operational task has ballooned into a $65,000 black hole of compliance costs.
Unbelievable.
And that is before you have even turned the key in the tractor to begin the actual work.
Now, human nature being what it is, a lot of farmers looking at a $70,000 bill just to spray some weeds might think, you know what? I've managed this land my whole life. The government is being ridiculous. I'm just going to go out on Saturday and do the work without the paperwork.
I'm sure many will think that.
But the enforcement side of this new national EPA is designed to crush exactly that kind of thinking, isn't it?
The enforcement mechanisms are incredibly hard-edged. The national EPA is being granted the power to issue immediate environment protection orders.
Which means?
In practical terms, these are mandatory stop work orders that halt all activity on your property. Furthermore, the financial penalties for non-compliance have been massively escalated. We are looking at maximum penalties of up to 1,000 penalty units for individuals and a staggering 5,000 penalty units for body corporates.
For context, a penalty unit is usually hundreds of dollars, so we are talking about hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of dollars in fines. It is enterprise-destroying liability.
And beyond the sheer financial ruin of the fines, there is the reputational damage engineered into the system through public compliance registers. The national EPA will possess the power to conduct unannounced, no-notice compliance audits.
Wait, they can just show up on the farm without warning?
Yes. And whatever the outcome of that regulatory interaction, whether you are formally fined, found non-compliant, or even if you just agree to an enforceable undertaking to fix an issue, it is published on a public electronic register.
Which completely ignores the modern reality of agricultural business.
Yeah.
Farmers aren't operating in a vacuum. If I end up on a public federal environmental naughty list, it isn't just a matter of embarrassment.
It impacts the bottom line.
Think about the supply chain. If I supply beef or grain to a major supermarket chain, they have strict ESG environmental, social, and governance policies. They run automated checks against government registers. My supply contract could be suspended.
Exactly.
My bank, which holds a mortgage on the farm, has covenants in my loan requiring compliance with environmental laws. If they see a national EPA stop work order on a public register, they might revalue my risk profile or call in the loan. The reputational risk is a financial contagion.
That is the intended design of evidence-defensive compliance. The threat of the public register acts as a deterrent, forcing the landholder to overcomply and absorb the assessment costs just to stay off the radar. And this is further compounded by the introduction of protection statements and rulings.
Let's unpack those because the sources highlight how dangerous they are when combined with inaccurate maps.
Protection statements and rulings allow the federal government to lay down blanket protections over specific areas based on satellite mapping and federal databases.
Okay, but what's the issue there?
The issue is that these databases are notoriously broad. A satellite might identify a certain vegetation type on your farm and flag it as potential koala habitat, even if a koala hasn't been physically seen in that district for 50 years.
Just based on the type of trees.
Right. But because a federal protection statement has been issued over that mapped area, it turns into a strict don't touch overlay. Your local officer cannot override it. You are legally barred from managing that land, even if your management would involve removing fire hazards or invasive predators.
So the uncertainty and the fear of ruinous fines essentially force the farmer into a corner where doing absolutely nothing is the only legally safe option.
Yes.
Even if doing nothing means sitting back and watching invasive weeds choke out the native grasses or watching feral animals destroy the undergrowth, you are paralyzed by the legal liability of active management.
Precisely. You become a hostage to the compliance architecture.
Which brings us to a transition that absolutely defies belief. It is the core asymmetry of this entire legislative package. If agricultural land managers, the people stewarding 50% of the Australian landmass, are being crippled by $70,000 assessment fees, unannounced audits, and massive fines just for squaring a paddock, what is happening to the actual heavy industrial developers?
That's a great question.
The companies building the massive housing estates on the fringes of the cities, or the new energy and mining projects.
Yeah.
What rules are they playing by?
This is where the policy divergence becomes stark and, frankly, deeply controversial. While farmers are facing a severe escalation in compliance burdens, the government has taken a diametrically opposite approach for certain industrial sectors.
Opposite.
Yes. In fact, the government recently announced a dedicated $45 million fund explicitly designed to fast-track bilateral agreements specifically for housing, energy, and mining projects.
Let me synthesize this because I want to make sure the listener grasps the sheer scale of the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
The federal government has found $45 million in the budget to lay out a red carpet, greasing the wheels to speed up environmental approvals for property developers and mining companies.
That's exactly right.
How much of the Australian landmass do those specific sectors actually occupy?
According to the sources, housing, commercial development, and mining account for roughly 0.5% of the Australian land area.
Half of 1% of the land gets a $45 million fast track to bypass the very red tape that is being wrapped around the throats of the people managing 50% of the land. Did agriculture get any dedicated facilitation funding in that announcement?
Agriculture received zero dedicated facilitation funding. The sector managing half the continent is expected to absorb the friction and the costs entirely on its own.
But the asymmetry is so much worse than just unequal funding. Let's look at the actual mechanics of the new environmental offset standard. This is the rule book for what happens when someone inevitably destroys a piece of habitat.
Right.
If a massive property developer bulldozes the last remaining critically endangered woodland in a Western Sydney suburb to build a new subdivision, how do they offset that destruction under these new rules?
The new reforms introduce a mechanism called a restoration contribution charge. In plain terms, it allows developers who are clearing high-value habitat to simply pay a calculated fee into a central Commonwealth fund.
So they write a check. A check that, let's be honest, is probably a rounding error in the overall budget of a multi-million-dollar housing development. And once that check clears,
Once the fee is paid, the developer's obligation is entirely extinguished. They can walk away. They carry absolutely no long-term legal liability for ensuring that the ecological damage they caused is actually repaired.
so they are totally off the hook.
Completely. Critics of this system, including prominent think tanks like the Australia Institute, have explicitly labeled this a pay-to-destroy mechanism. The developer completely transfers all the financial, ecological, and legal risk back to the state.
They pay the fine, they pave the paradise, and they never think about it again. Now, let's look at the other side of the ledger. Who is actually expected to provide the land and the labor to offset that destruction?
The farmers.
What is the farmer's burden when they interact with this offset standard?
The contrast is jarring. Farmers cannot simply pay a fee to walk away from residual impacts on their land. Moreover, if a farmer chooses to participate in the offset market, say, they agree to protect a portion of their farm to generate offset credits to sell to that developer, they are subjected to incredibly draconian conditions.
Like what?
The draft offset standard requires the landholder to enter into legally secured covenants registered directly on their property title.
A covenant on the title. We aren't talking about a gentleman's agreement or a 5-year contract. How long do these maintenance periods last?
The standard mandates maintenance periods ranging from 25 years up to 100 years.
A 100-year covenant on a family farm. Let's talk about what that actually does to a family sitting around the dinner table discussing the future. You are legally binding your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren to specific land management practices.
It's a permanent encumbrance.
It completely dictates succession planning. If you try to sell the farm or pass it on, that encumbrance is permanently attached. And what does the bank do when they see a 100-year restrictive covenant on the title?
The bank immediately revalues the asset downward. The land loses its agricultural flexibility, which degrades its collateral value.
Of course.
But the restriction on title isn't even the most onerous part. It is not a passive restriction where you just fence off the trees and walk away. The standard requires active audited management, documented in what is typically a legally binding management plan that can exceed 400 pages in length.
A 400-page, federally audited legal contract. And what exactly does that contract demand the farmer achieve?
The critical phrasing in the draft standard demands that the offset provider, the farmer, must prevent loss and degradation of the protected environmental matter.
Prevent loss and degradation.
Yeah.
Okay, on the superficial level, that sounds like standard conservation language. But when you apply the rigid legal definitions of what causes loss and degradation, it turns into a nightmare of liability, doesn't it?
It raises a profoundly important question about the legal boundaries of liability. To understand how dangerous this is, the sources point us to a chilling existing precedent under the EPBC framework, the South 32 Worsley Offset Plan in Western Australia.
Walk me through what happened in that specific offset plan, because it illustrates exactly what these 400-page contracts entail.
Under these comprehensive management plans, the landholder is legally required to manage all EPBC-listed key threatening processes that might impact the protected species on their site.
Okay.
Now, for many native species, those threatening processes include
The property developer pays a discounted tax-deductible fine to bulldoze an endangered habitat, and they are entirely off the hook. Meanwhile, the family farmer who hosts the offset is forced to sign a 400-page, legally binding contract that makes them liable for a century of conservation.
Yep.
And because that contract demands they legally prevent loss and degradation, that individual family farmer is technically legally bound to solve global atmospheric chemistry, to mitigate climate change, and to cure incurable biological pandemics on their own dime.
That is the practical legal reality of how the subordinate legislation is drafted. The fatal flaw in the draft standard is the omission of common sense. There is no explicit legal carve-out stating that individual landholders cannot be held responsible for systemic, non-local threatening processes.
So let's play out the worst-case scenario. A farmer signs the 100-year covenant, they fence off the woodland, they bait the foxes, they do everything right locally,
A perfect steward.
right? But a historic, continent-wide drought hits driven by global climate change, and the protected trees die. Or an incurable fungus sweeps through the district and wipes out the endangered frogs on the offset site. What happens to the farmer?
Under the strict letter of their audited 400-page management plan, the farmer has failed to prevent loss and degradation. Therefore, they are in breach of their legally binding federal contract. They are exposed to those massive penalty units, the 1,000 individual or 5,000 corporate units, and the national EPA compliance registers.
It is an impossible contract. It is forcing a local land manager to guarantee biological outcomes against the laws of physics and macro-environmental shifts that are entirely out of their control.
It's setting them up to fail.
Which naturally leads us to a massive structural question. Why? If the overarching goal of this entire agonizing legislative overhaul is to genuinely save the Australian environment and reverse the extinction crisis, why did the government design a system that explicitly punishes and alienates the very people who actively manage half the continent?
Well, to understand that, we need to compare the government's punitive compliance approach with the path they explicitly chose not to take. This is where the political tragedy of the policy really reviews itself. The government knew exactly what was required to fix the environment because the scientific community handed them the blueprint.
They literally gave them the plan.
Exactly. In July 2024, a landmark report was released, spearheaded by scientists from the Australian National University ANU and the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists. They produced a comprehensive, costed blueprint detailing the exact mechanisms required to genuinely reverse environmental decline in Australia.
And what was the price tag on that genuine, scientifically backed recovery? Because the governments always cry poor when it comes to the environment.
The scientists calculated that Australia needs to invest $7.3 billion annually over a 30-year period to repair the historical degradation and stabilize the ecosystems.
$7.3 billion a year. Now, to the average person, that sounds like a colossal amount of money. But let's put that in macroeconomic context. What percentage of the national economy is that?
It represents approximately 0.3% of Australia's gross domestic product.
0.3% of GDP to save the entire biosphere of a continent. In the context of a federal budget that spends hundreds of billions on defense, welfare, and infrastructure, 0.3% of GDP seems like the bargain of the century.
It really does.
And what did the ANU and Wentworth scientists say that $7.3 billion actually needed to be spent on? Because the sources emphasize a really crucial distinction here. Real biodiversity recovery is labor-intensive. It is not paperwork-intensive.
Precisely. You do not save a critically endangered species by conducting a compliance audit or publishing a farmer's name on a register.
Right.
The ANU and Wentworth Group blueprint detail that the funding needs to go directly toward active, on-ground landscape management. We are talking about the physical, dirty work of repairing nature.
Like what specifically?
Repairing high-risk erosion gullies, fencing off miles of riparian zones along rivers to keep cattle out of the water, physically spraying millions of hectares of invasive weeds, aggressively managing feral predator populations like cats, foxes, and wild pigs, altering the landscape fire regimes through traditional and controlled cool burning, and actively replanting and restoring 13 million hectares of degraded native vegetation.
It is people in boots, driving utes, doing hard physical labor on the land. It is treating environmental stewardship as a funded public service. The scientists essentially said, fund the farmers, fund the land managers, and pay them to do the actual physical work of fixing the continent.
That was the scientifically endorsed path, a massive cooperative funding model that partnered with the people already living on and managing the land.
But the Commonwealth looked at that blueprint, looked at the $7.3 billion price tag, and chose a very different path.
The Commonwealth chose the fiscally cheaper, politically expedient path. Instead of funding on-ground stewardship and paying landholders to repair nature, the government decided to shift the cost of environmental protection entirely onto the private sector.
Onto the farmers.
Specifically onto landholders, yes, through the mechanism of strict punitive compliance.
So instead of a $7.3 billion investment flowing into the regions to pay for fencing and weed management, we get the national EPA in Canberra. We get satellite data integration through environment information, Australia watching from orbit.
Yep.
And we get a regulatory structure that forces the landholder to pay $20,000 to $70,000 out of their own pocket for a consultant's ecological report. They replaced a shovel with a 400-page form.
Yes. And if we pull back the curtain on the political history of how these laws were drafted, we can see exactly why this happened.
Why did it happen?
When this reform process started years ago, the major environmental groups and conservation lobbies actually campaigned for both pillars. They wanted the strong, enforceable regulatory protections to stop bad actors, and they lobbied hard for the massive landscape funding model to achieve the actual restoration.
But when that package hit the realities of cabinet meetings and federal budgets, the Treasury Department balked.
Exactly. The massive $7.3 billion funding model failed politically. It was deemed too expensive, or at least not a high enough priority compared to other budget demands.
So the carrot disappeared.
The funding for cooperative restoration completely disappeared, but the environment ministers still needed to deliver a political win to their constituents. They needed to look tough on conservation.
So they kept the stick.
So the strict regulations, the EPA, the massive fines, not only survived the cabinet process, they expanded to fill the void.
Which forces me to ask the most cynical but necessary question of this entire deep dive. Does forcing a farmer to spend $70,000 to write a 400-page report actually save a single threatened species? Or does it just create an incredibly well-documented extinction?
The critical analysis from the sources argues exactly the latter. A highly documented, legally defensive compliance architecture does not pull a single weed. It does not shoot a single feral cat. It does not plant a single tree.
Right, it just documents the decline.
It merely ensures that when a native species finally slips into extinction, the government bureaucracy possesses a pristine, audited paper trail proving that it wasn't an administrative error on their part. The focus shifts entirely from ecological outcomes to legal risk management.
It is a tragedy of process over outcome. Which brings us to a glaring question about the democratic process itself. With such obvious systemic flaws in the design, with massive compliance costs, impossible legal liabilities, and a framework that actively punishes the stewards of the land, where were the farmer advocacy groups during the drafting of these laws, surely an industry that manages half the country saw this freight train coming.
Oh, they saw it coming from miles away, and they have been screaming about it for years.
Really?
Yes. The major agricultural peak bodies, specifically the National Farmers Federation, the NFF, the NSW Farmers Association, the NSWFA, and the Victorian Farmers Federation, the VFF, have not been silent. They have submitted extensive, highly detailed, and technically rigorous feedback over the last 6 years across multiple government inquiries, draft consultations, and Senate hearings.
Let's unpack what they actually asked for, because from what I've read in the sources, they weren't asking to strip away environmental protections. They were asking for basic operational pragmatism. What was the NF demanding at the federal level?
The NFF's demands were deeply pragmatic. First, they asked for road-tested standards. They argued quite logically that you cannot lock in sweeping, continent-wide rules written in a Canberra office without proving they are practical on a real operational farm first.
Which is just basic common sense. You wouldn't roll out a radically new tractor engine designed to 50% of the country without testing it in the mud first to see if it actually works.
Precisely. The NFF also demanded the explicit embedding of ecologically sustainable development, or ESD, principles into the core of the standards.
What does ESD actually mean in practice?
ESD is a well-established concept that requires decision-makers to actively balance environmental targets with the economic and social realities of the community. They wanted to guarantee that farm viability wouldn't be sacrificed entirely for rigid environmental dogmatism.
That makes sense.
And crucially, the NFS strongly opposed the normalization of permanent covenants on property titles as the default mechanism for offsets, warning the government directly about the catastrophic long-term impacts on land values and generational succession planning.
Sensible, practical demands. What about the state-level bodies? What was the NSW Farmers Association pushing for?
The NSWFA focused heavily on fairness and the realities of historical land use. They specifically asked for statutory protection from being penalized for historic government decisions.
Historic decisions.
Yes. They argued that farmers should not be held retrospectively liable for land clearing or management practices that were legally mandated or even subsidized by previous state governments decades ago.
Right, because historically, governments literally paid farmers to clear land to develop the agricultural sector. It's wildly unjust to turn around 50 years later and criminalize the maintenance of that same land.
Exactly. The NSWFA also requested the creation of simple central mapping portals. They wanted a system where a farmer could log on, look at their property, and actually see all the environmental overlays affecting their land in clear, unambiguous terms without needing to hire a $20,000 consultant to interpret the data.
Transparency.
And fundamentally, their overarching plea was that the government treat farmers as active partners in conservation, rather than presumptive compliance targets.
And the Victorian Farmers Federation, how did they approach the consultation?
The VFF called for an immediate end to blanket controls. They pointed out that rigid, top-down environmental rules drafted in the city often ignore basic realities on the ground.
Like what?
Most notably, human safety and catastrophic fire risks. If a farmer isn't allowed to clear undergrowth because it's deemed potential habitat, that fuel load builds up until a bushfire wipes out the habitat, the farm, and the surrounding community.
That's a huge issue in Victoria.
Absolutely. They advocated strongly for a return to the land care partnership model, which relies on local agricultural knowledge and cooperative funding rather than adversarial top-down regulation.
So we have the three largest, most well-resourced agricultural peak bodies in the country submitting incredibly detailed, pragmatic frameworks for how to make environmental protection actually work alongside food and fiber production. They engaged in the process for 6 years.
6 long years.
What was the result? When these exposure drafts were finally published, how much of their feedback was incorporated?
The result was near total disregard. If you read the standards currently up for consultation, they contradict, undermine, or simply ignore virtually every substantive demand the agricultural peak bodies made.
Give me the specifics. Where did they lose out?
Everywhere. The NFF asked for road testing. The standards are being pushed through on a rapid, politically driven timeline without comprehensive on-farm trials.
No trials.
None. The NFF asked for a continuing use discount or a sensible approach to the 15-year rule. The draft imposes a hard, unforgiving 15-year cutoff that treats multi-generational grazing like greenfield development.
Right.
The state bodies begged for a true no-duplication clause to save them from dealing with 2 layers of bureaucracy. Instead, they get the not inconsistent with trap that forces state officers to become aggressive federal delegates.
And what about the ESD principles, the economic balance?
The concept of ecologically sustainable development, which was supposed to protect farm viability, is relegated to a minor footnote, completely failing to balance economic realities. And despite the desperate warnings about land devaluation, 100-year restrictive covenants remain the preferred security mechanism for offsets.
How does that happen in a functioning democracy? How does an entire vital economic sector, the people responsible for managing half the continent and feeding the nation, get completely sidelined in the drafting of the very laws that govern their land?
Impartially speaking, we have to look at the political reality and the dynamics of the drafting room in Canberra.
Who was in the room?
The policy development process was overwhelmingly influenced by groups that possess full-time, highly specialized legal policy staff, environmental law NGOs, such as the Environmental Defender's Office, and specialized academic groups like the Biodiversity Council were incredibly well coordinated and effective at lobbying the bureaucracy.
So it was a battle of legal wording, and the NGOs outgunned the farmers in the committee rooms.
Yes. They pushed relentlessly for harder language, demanding legally binding phrases like must prevent instead of flexible guidelines like should manage. They successfully argued that any local discretion was a loophole that needed to be closed.
So the bureaucracy just listened to the lawyers.
From a bureaucratic standpoint, the departments essentially treated the agricultural input as a mandatory consultation checkbox. They hosted the town halls, they listened to the farmers, they politely filed the submissions, and then they turned around and wrote the standards based almost entirely on the rigid compliance priorities of the conservation law sector.
It is a phenomenal, almost tragic disconnect between the policymakers sitting in air-conditioned offices in the city and the reality of the people sitting on the tractors dealing with drought, fire, and feral pests. But as dark and as daunting as the picture we have painted today is, the ink on these regulations is not yet completely dry.
That's the crucial takeaway here.
Which brings us to the final and most important part of our deep dive today.
That is correct. The legislative trap is set, but the statutory consultation period is technically still open. This is the absolute final window for intervention.
So let's summarize exactly what is at stake for the listener. The EPBC reforms represent a massive tectonic shift in power. We are moving from a system of local, pragmatic land management to a highly centralized, evidence-defensive, federal compliance architecture.
Yep.
State officers are going to lose their professional discretion and become auditors. Massive industrial property developers are getting a $45 million fast-track red carpet so they can pay a fee and wash their hands of environmental damage.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, the family farmers are getting handed the massive compliance bill The $70,000 assessment fees, the unannounced audits, the 400-page management plans, and the legal liability for systemic global threatening processes like climate change.
The asymmetry is staggering, and the economic impacts on regional Australia will be profound if these drafts become finalized law, and that is why the call to action right now is so urgent.
If you are a farmer, if you are a member of an agricultural group, if you work in the regional supply chain, or if you simply care about the future viability of food and fiber production in this country, you cannot afford to sit this out.
No, you can't.
You must submit feedback on the exposure drafts for the MNES standard and the environmental offsets standard. Give us the hard deadline again.
The absolute deadline for submissions is 11:59 p.m. AEST on June 9, 2026.
June 9, 2026. Put it in your calendar, stick it on the fridge. Now, based on the extensive breakdown of the sources we've discussed today, if someone is sitting down at their kitchen table tonight to write their submission, what are the 3 non-negotiable demands they need to highlight to the government?
Based on the alignment of the peak agricultural bodies, the submissions must hammer home 3 key structural changes to the drafts. First, demand a true, watertight, no duplication clause with state schemes. The legislation must explicitly state that if a state system like a RAMA code is accredited, it entirely replaces the federal requirement. It cannot just add a layer of federal auditing on top of the state officer.
Right. And the second demand?
Second, demand the immediate fixing of the 15-year rule under Section 43B. There must be a recognized continuing use pathway that respects sustainable, cyclical agricultural management. An 18 to 20-year grazing cycle is not greenfield development, and the law must reflect the biological reality of the landscape, not an arbitrary administrative calendar.
And the third demand? The one regarding the offset contracts.
Third, and perhaps most vitally regarding long-term legal and financial survival, demand an explicit, ironclad legal carve-out in the offset standard. The standard must explicitly state that private landholders cannot, under any circumstances, be held legally or financially responsible for managing systemic, non-local threatening processes such as global climate change or continent-wide feral diseases on their offset sites.
You cannot contractually bind a single-family farm to solve global atmospheric chemistry. It is absurd, it is unjust, and it has to be called out in every single submission. June 9, 2026. The window is closing fast.
It is the final opportunity to push back against a paradigm shift that will permanently alter the rural landscape.
We started this deep dive talking about a tectonic plate shift. We talked about the absurdity of the sovereign garden, where a suburban homeowner suddenly needs a $20,000 federal flora assessment just to mow the lawn she has safely mowed for 40 years.
Yeah.
But I want you to scale that absurdity up. Scale it up from a quarter-acre suburban block to encompass 50% of the entire Australian continent. The government claims that modern environmental policy relies on the concept of social license and cooperative stewardship. But I want to leave you with the lingering, visceral question to ponder long after this deep dive ends.
What is that?
What happens to the Australian landscape when the people actually managing half the continent look at these new rules? When they look at the unannounced federal audits, the 400-page contracts, the $70,000 consultant fees, the 100-year covenants, and the $45 million developer fast track, and they realize the game is rigged.
It's a dark thought.
What happens when a generation of farmers decides that the safest, most rational legal and financial choice is to simply disengage entirely, to retreat? What happens to the environment when the stewards of the land just shut their gates, lock away the tractors in the shed, let the weeds grow, let the feral animals run rampant, and stop actively managing the land at all because the legal risk of trying to care for it is simply too high?
A landscape without active, engaged stewards is a landscape left to the weeds, the ferals, and the catastrophic fires.
And creating a legal system that forces farmers to walk away, well, that might just be the most devastating environmental outcome of all.